Hello and welcome. I am Ryan from The Way of the Leaf, and we welcome you to our show, WoT You Feeling. This show is designed as a thoughtful and engaging exploration into the mental health and emotional health aspects of the world of Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time. We hope to create an open discussion about mental health, the role of society, and how these can be viewed through a lens of empathy and support. Joining us as always are Miki and Christine, and our guest host for this show is Anna of the Grey Aja.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm not an expert as you guys are, but I'm what you could call an interested amateur. I did some social psychology in my bachelor's, but not as a main topic. But I love what you are doing and what you have been doing, because we all as readers of The Wheel of Time encounter all these issues and don't always have the tools to talk about it, and you give those to us. So maybe tell me, how did the show go so far? What are your experiences in doing this?
I think so far it's been going well. I mean, we've had our first episode as WoT You Feeling, and then we had an episode early on where we were guests on the Dusty Wheel, which was really exciting. And that's pretty much how we decided that this is sort of what we want to do, that we just have a lot of fun together and we all love nerding out about the same things. So yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, I think the response has been really, really positive, and it's surprisingly positive. And it seems like people got a little bit of a little boost from it. So hopefully we can provide the same this week.
Yeah, and I would add too that I think that I think I said in our first show, it's just really nice to be able to like geek out about both, mental health and psychology and the Wheel of Time at the same time. And I know we've had a lot of discussions between the three of us of potential show topics. And last time the chat was really active and other ideas they'd like to see. And so really what I'm picking up from it is there's really no limit to the things that we can talk about. Because just the world of Robert Jordan is so deep and it's so human. Mm-hmm. And so there's so many crossover pieces, right?
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a sneak peek in what you have planned down the road?
Oh, good question.
Yeah.
I'm going to stump you.
You can try.
Definitely the role
you
of
see me looking over because there's a whole list. Let me pull up the list.
Oh, please.
You don't have to give everything away.
Just a teaser.
Okay, first thing my eyes landed on, anxiety or the lack thereof in the Wheel of Time. Why do we not see more anxiety? The world's ending. Or parenting. How do we see parenting played out in the Wheel of Time? The identity development of our main characters. What does that look like? We could just go on and on and on. But yeah, so I guess I could also throw in the topic for tonight. Would it be good to kind of name what we're hoping to talk about tonight?
Yeah, good call, Miki.
Yes. So this is one that it was an idea that hit, I don't remember when, but I think in a couple of other conversations that we were having with folks, the idea came up that, Robert Jordan is just this artist in depicting the unreliable narrator. And so in a lot of Wheel of Time conversations I've been in, they talk about how good he is at writing from a POV, but writing that POV in the way that we would experience it as a person, right? Like that it's a little inaccurate. And it's not till your second or third read through sometimes that you're like, oh, that's not actually what was happening. That's just what that character thought was happening, or it was skewed by what that character thought was happening. Mm-hmm. Which then for me really hits like, that's what we all do, right? We all have our own perspective of the world. Reality is relative. It's all filtered through our own lens. And so wanted to talk a little bit more about those filters that we all have and how sometimes we can be our own unreliable narrator at times in the world.
Okay, I have to say something about that, because when I looked a little bit into your topic of today, when you told me, I found out the title is actually not completely correct. I don't think that the Wheel of Time actually has unreliable narrators. It works as a third-person limited narrator. And the people are limited by their own perception of events, of others, and of themselves. They don't lie to the reader because there is no reader. We are hearing their thoughts. An unreliable narrator, for example, is in Lolita, which is told from the perspective of the abuser, who
Right.
tells this to a jury, if I'm remembering this correctly. And so he actually excuses what he's telling to manipulate. This is not what's happening in the Wheel of Time. The people don't try to manipulate. They are just very limited in what they experience. And so this is why I thought this is a really interesting topic, because we can look at this in two different ways. What does it mean to the reader? How does it impact the story? And what does it tell us about ourselves, about the way we think, which is in a way narrate our own story to ourselves? And I'm very curious what you have to say about all this.
I love this. That is so excellent, Anna.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. That's a, I think it's a not so, it feels like a subtle distinction, but when you really bore down into it, you are talking about something that is accurate. And like,
Right.
I think of Nabokov, when I think about the unreliable narrator that you're discussing, like there's several novels where the actual narrator POV is literally mentally ill, and so you can't rely on that because that person's having issues. Although I think there are several chapters, I mean, certain characters POV. So if we are in a Pat and Fane POV, is that an unreliable narrator?
I don't think so, because I think he still doesn't try to convince someone of something. We just still hear his thoughts. They're objectively wrong. But this is because he is a limited third-person narrator. He is limited to what he sees, and this is very skewed by the issues he has, of which there are many.
For sure.
I understand that unreliable narrator is the term that is usually used to discuss things like that, but I thought if we are going into a more scientific, then we should maybe clarify it. It's still a better title.
I'm happy to just adopt the limited third person narrator for sure. Yeah, like we can actually because I think that's what we're getting at, and that's what we've kind of prepared to talk about. So
yes,
if it's
what
just,
limits us?
Yeah, what limits us for sure, and Robert Jordan's writing is so amazing because he does it so subtly and so well. Like everyone who's talking has their own limitations, and then the narrator who's observing the talking is limited in what they're able to see also, and he's able to write that all in and make it all feel natural, like real life, which is kind of why this is an interesting topic for us, because that is real life. Everyone we're interacting with have their own like life story that produces exceptionalities and limitations, and they're like living their story at that moment that they're talking, and then someone else that we're watching them talk, they have their life story with their experiences and their limitations, and they're having a conversation. I myself, observing that conversation, have my own life story with my own exceptionalities and limitations, and that dynamic interplay can cause havoc. And I think it's fascinating to talk about, because I think this might underline a lot of misunderstandings between human beings when well-meaning parties are coming together with good intentions, but they still have conflict because we're not all able to, in the moment, understand that this is what's happening, and we need to I think it's a very fruitful conversation because of it's so real in everyone's like lived experiences, for sure. regardless of it of the terms we use. So I'm happy to adopt a third person limited narrator.
Yes.
You don't have to do that. It's a mouthful.
It's more accurate, though.
Thrilled about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking from a mental health perspective, one approach to addressing mental health concerns is narrative therapy. It's a theoretical orientation, a form of therapy, which is to help people unpack the narratives that they carry with them, right? And so I really actually like this, this term even better, because it's not that you are unreliable. It's just that there's, it's limited, right? And understanding the limits that that the world brings to us, or that are happening internally for us, can help kind of ease the burden of trying to hold the truth, right? That sometimes we feel like we have to know, with a capital K, know what's going on. And sometimes if we can just accept that, our perspective may be limited at this point, and we're going to understand the narrative to the best of our ability, that can really help, like Ryan was saying, when there's conflict going on, recognizing my narrative might be slightly different than that person's narrative, and how can I approach that?
I think that's fair. And I think too, because we're not omniscient beings, we're human, right? Our minds are finite. Everything that we can make sense of is finite. So we can't really ever know what someone else is thinking or feeling in the moment. And truth can be very subjective, because we just don't know. We don't always know. So what's true for me may not be true for someone else based on their life experiences. And so I also really like the way that you brought that up, Anna, because I think unreliable narrator, now that we sort of dig into it a little bit more deeply, would suggest that this is something that's been written in the first person rather than the third person. And you're right, there is no deception here. It's not like we're reading about characters trying to deceive the reader. So I'm really glad actually that you brought up that distinction, because I think it is kind of an important distinction the more that we talk about it.
Yes, I think I think that's the reason that you actually picked this topic as pertaining to mental health, because it's more about the story that you tell yourself, how you perceive life. To jump into another question. Oh, and what I wanted to say is there are many novels that have third-person limited narrator, but mostly you don't notice it as much. And I think that just comes from Robert Jordan's strength in writing different voices. And that's the reason why we read 15 huge books without getting bored, because we always know in whose head we are, because they are so different. And that's what I wanted to ask next, to stay in the reader's perspective. One, do you like this style of narration? Do you think there are weaknesses in it? What about something tricky, sexual abuse, the thing with Thailand? We discuss this so much because Matt does not call it what it is. So is this a weakness? Because we never get a real answer about what is going on there, or is it a strength because it shows us how people react?
I think it's both. I think it's a weakness in that it is subjective. When we know that sexual abuse and using, your position of power to extort.
Should we have given a spoiler warning before we jump into
this is the full spoilers.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Yeah, but we know that it's objectively wrong, right, to manipulate people and to use sex as a means of controlling them or abusing them in any way. So I feel like that's where this type of narration falls short, because it doesn't objectively state that what is happening is wrong and that it is abuse and that it's not okay and it's harmful. So in my opinion, yeah, that's where this can fall short. And it's something that people still argue about all the time. I see people always arguing about Matt and Thailand and Nynaeve and Egwene and, these various instances of sexual abuse. And I think because it's not clearly laid out in the books that it's wrong, people see it as a gray area when really it isn't one.
Yeah, but that might be I think you're right. There is this kind of balance piece of it being both a strength and a weakness. And I think that's where it reflects real life, right? Is that as readers, we can take that omniscient view. We know multiple viewpoints that are happening in the book. We also can read this and say, oh, this is what this is abuse. But as a person living through an event, it's hard to have an omniscient view. And in fact, that can cause so much internal distress, especially when we get messages from the outside of other people being like, oh, you should have known
Yes.
XYZ.
Right.
And I think sometimes that's what we fall into as readers of books is, it's like watching a horror movie and be like, well, don't go down the stairs. Duh, of course we know don't go down the stairs. You're in a horror movie, but does the character know they're in a horror movie? Maybe not. So kind of that piece of like, I suppose it depends on like what's the purpose here, like, and in some ways an omniscient view maybe in sharing a message, whereas this person view is about sharing an experience.
That's a really good point. I love this discussion. I'm trying to think about, specifically the Matt and Thailand situation, how Matt responds. Is there something to be said about how effective that is for the individual? Like did that response, did Matt responding in that way benefit him or harm him? And maybe it's we could also add that into the equation in terms of how we think about this, because I'm trying to see evidence of further down the line in the story that showing evidence of being some sort of like hindrance or harming him or making him like less capable. Does that make sense?
I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think initially it definitely helped him. I think, he had a way to cope with what was happening to him, especially because nobody was really supporting him. I mean, everybody was just sort of like, yeah, lucky you, kind of thing, which unfortunately is the way that sexual abuse towards men has historically been dealt with, especially at the hands of a woman. I think one place where Robert Jordan fell short was that I don't think we really saw the bottom fallout for Matt with regard to what happened with Thailand. So for me, I kind of find that to be a little bit lacking in what happens in instances of sexual abuse.
It might have been nice if it had been more balanced, if we would have seen it from different perspectives, and if at least one of them would have realized this as wrong.
Yeah.
Even to help readers, because I know there are a lot of readers who never even question, and I did not question the first time I read it. The first time I read it, I thought, oh, cool, they're having a BDSM relationship in this book. How fun. And it would have been nice to give like a little helping hand by including just one perspective of one person who looked at this and said, like Brigitte, for example, would have been perfect for this, who looked at her friend and said, what is being done to you is just wrong.
Yeah. Or are you okay with this? Is this consensual? Is this a consensual BDSM relationship?
Right.
It was not consensual. So that's what makes it not okay.
Right.
Right. And I think that's one of the things, right, is that, Ryan, you asked, is this way of looking at it, was it helpful for Matt? And I think if we think about one of the ways that people approach what we call cognitive dissonance. So when there's an event happening that doesn't fit in your internal narrative of what should be happening or what you believe could happen, then your mind does some gymnastics at times to try and make sense of it. And sometimes it creates a story that isn't accurate, and we need somebody on the outside. I like this idea of Brigitte being able to look at it, because Brigitte wouldn't have cognitive dissonance, right? She would look at it and say, that's wrong. If you're not okay with that, then it shouldn't happen. And we need sometimes those outside perspectives to help us shift narratives that have gone in a direction that isn't helpful for us.
Now, and I don't know if this is necessarily specific to this specific topic of sexual abuse, because we've also talked, and in one of our further episodes we alluded to is going to be about like anxiety and like how are these people going through these crazy things and just moving on, like how is this not like any. So it feels to me like there's so much, it's a limitation of Robert Jordan as a whole, where he's putting these characters in extreme situations and then they just move on. And the only character we see having to go through some sort of trauma narrative feels to be like Egwene, where we really get in her, as far as my memory and where I'm at in my reread, Egwene seems to be the one character who's having a trauma experience, going through it, showing behavioral changes based on that, having different. Well, I guess Rand is kind of good.
I think
now
Rand
that I'm
does.
talking about it, Rand.
Yeah, but Rand
so
has
we have
always the extra thing of magical madness added to it, so we never know.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Rand has, so many other forces pushing against him, but all the other characters they go through just some of the worst things ever, and they just seem to just wake up and move on. And it seems to be just kind of a limitation of Robert. I'm postulating it's a limitation of Robert Jordan as a whole, and not necessarily his ability to get into one specific
Right.
trauma narrative versus the other, or whatever, male, sexual narrative, all of those. He's not diving into anyone's trauma narrative. He just like puts them in these situations. They go, and then they move on because they have to. And this kind of man up kind of mentality. We'll just got to push forward.
Yeah. I think that's true. I would have liked to have seen more with Fail after everything that she went through, being kidnapped and just the living in constant fear and just all of the things that she had to do to survive that. It just seems very unlikely to me that she would have then fallen right back into her relationship with Perrin without flinching, and literally without ever flinching, right? She doesn't ever flinch when someone tries to touch her. She doesn't wake up, having nightmares. Like there doesn't seem to be any sort of residual trauma that's unresolved for her, which it's hard for me, especially because we see this over and over and over again with these characters who experience trauma in the series, where I feel like he's really good at describing the traumatic event. And he's really good at describing aspects of things like PTSD with regard to Rand. But then it just kind of sort of ends there. And then we, like you said, we just sort of like move on with the story.
But could that be part of this, third person limited narrator piece, or
right?
This perspective piece? Because how often are we in Fael's head after that? How much are other people noticing those pieces that are part of a trauma response and accurately interpreting it as such,
right?
And I don't know, I'd have to kind of go back. I think it's a really good question, but I like this idea of thinking about, like, is that one of the things that you get in this, like, limited third person perspective, is that well, I think we see it at the very beginning of the books, right? Because at the first book, we're in Rand's head so often, and there's just so much he misses. I was just noting somebody, talking the other day about, like, what was the level of destruction in Emmons Field after the initial Trolloc attack? And we don't actually know, but that's because we're just in Rand's head, and he's not thinking about it. So it doesn't mean that there wasn't massive destruction. It's just that he's in sort of this, like, tunnel vision piece and isn't picking up those details that might be there.
That's a good point.
Before we move on, let's acknowledge the chat here. They have some things to say about what we're talking about. Daniel says, I think Matt's thoughts where his experiences stress, but he doesn't call it abuse is accurate. I don't think he ever processed it. There should have been emotional fallout at those. So, yeah, that's great. The emotional fallout. That's one. I think that's kind of encapsulate what we're talking about. There doesn't seem to be a lot of emotional fallout.
Yes, he reacts more strongly to the fact that Tyrion is murdered and that he feels guilty about it. And I think it all mushes into one big blob for him.
Yeah, and he starts to have I can't remember details now. Like the pink scarves start to have particular meaning for him. And
The ribbons, yes.
Exactly. He's conflicted about the ribbons.
So if we want to move on, we can actually connect to Perrin, because he has been mentioned, because Perrin is an interesting person in this, because he tends to react to people's emotions because he is a olfactory empath, I would call it.
Yeah.
That's great.
In a very unrealistic way, let's be honest. But
Yeah.
okay, let's assume he knows when people's moods are shifting, what are they feeling, and he reacts to this. And this often does not work. So let's talk about what it means to assume when interacting with other people.
I think this was an idea that it kind of hit me the other day, that really for me, it came out of this idea, a lot of conversation that's going on in the community that I really appreciate about kind of privilege and ableism within the community, and recognizing how much of our language and our actions are focused on sight, and how that minimizes or diminishes the experience of those who may not be sighted but have maybe other ways of engaging in the world. And it made me begin to wonder, right? Is Perrin actually any worse at empathizing and picking up emotions than the rest of us? Because for sighted folks, oftentimes we are reacting to other people's micro expressions, right? That shift of an eyebrow, or that small smile that we get, or whatever it is. But a lot of times we project our own assumptions onto the other person about what those micro expressions mean. And I think that's exactly what's happening with Perrin, but with scent. But I think the readers, because I suspect many readers are sighted folks, are reacting to Perrin doing it in a slightly different way, and not really recognizing, like, oh, I might actually do that too. How many times have I been, like hanging out with someone and being like, oh, they were so pissed at me. Did you see the way that they, that expression on their face? It's like, maybe they were, but maybe that wasn't actually their internal experience.
Yes, and maybe it wasn't about me, because we always assume that that when someone is angry, that they must be angry at us, and not that they're maybe having just a very, very shitty day. And also we tend to give ourselves the benefit of having very complex emotions, and everybody else is reduced to very simple emotions. And that's what Perrin does. She smells jealous, full stop. What does that even mean? Being jealous is a very complex thing. She might be jealous of the fact that other people have it easier right now than she has.
He might be. So there's this phenomenon where we have, I believe, that we have emotions that are more productive for us. So we use emotions when we are having real other emotions that are less productive for us and more uncomfortable to deal with. So it's not uncommon for people to just get mad when they're sad, to recoil, it just on and on, like the variety of ways that we are able to like have an emotional experience, and underneath it there's a real true emotional state that we don't want to acknowledge or access, because that's harder to deal with. So it might be that Perrin is limited because he's just kind of assessing that first kind of like protective emotion. So jealousy is a complicated emotion. So we call it complicated because we think that it's, I think like, it's not like because jealousy is like a bunch of things put together. I think it's just jealousy, and underneath it, fear of loss, all the history of anything that person experienced that reminds them of the thing that they're saying in the moment that's making them feel that way. So yeah, I never thought of it about this until we got into it, but yeah, like parent could be limited because what he is experiencing is not the true base emotion. He's experiencing kind of the knee-jerk protective emotion that we all kind of go through in life.
Mhm.
Just the one with the strongest scent. Whatever happens to reek.
Yeah, and I think Anna, you bring up a really excellent point though, because in wolf language, we are told over and over and over again about how complex things are, right? You know, this is not Moon Dancer. This is, you know, the way that the moonlight, he dances across the pond on a mid-afternoon, whatever, you know, I can't remember the details, but it's so complex every time they're giving these kind of signs and to each other, to other wolves. But we see Perrin get really limited when it comes to emotional reasoning. Like, what emotion am I experiencing? Oh, it's jealousy, like you said, full stop. Whereas one would expect, perhaps, if the wolves are able to be as complex in language or in naming things, they would do the same thing with emotional experience, right? This is not just jealousy. This is the feeling one gets when they see someone that they love happen to glance sideways at someone else on a sunny afternoon, you know, like that's what I'm wanting.
That's
So Perrin is lost in translation.
Yes.
Can't say that has never happened to me.
It's almost like he took that idea, like, oh, your dog smells fear, and then just, you know, ran with it.
Well, I kind of liken it to, he had like half a semester of wolf language, and he's trying to be fluent, right? So again, his perception is very limited because he has a very limited vocabulary of how to actually
I can
use
absolutely
this skill.
relate. Sometimes I have very complex thoughts that I can't articulate because I don't have all the words that I would have if I spoke to you in my native language.
Mm-hmm.
Well, English is a nice language because there are so many words, but German is more complex and more precise. So sometimes it's hard for me. So maybe it's something like that. He gets very, very complex input and only has very limited means of translating them into his human inner monologue.
Right.
And it boils down to one emotion. And then he reacts to that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So from that, we can go to other things that limit the way that we see other people and react to them. Biases, for example, or the ever-present cultural misunderstandings that we have. Any examples that you'd like to give us?
I have a few, but I actually might. Is it okay if we backtrack for just a second? Because something you were saying there about the language thing is really sticking out to me. Because I think that is such a valuable point, right? If we don't have the language, how do we then communicate to others, but also to ourselves, what's happening? And I think it's really amplified when you're talking about like being bilingual or speaking different languages, and you know what you're missing. But I think a lot of us maybe raised in a way where we're not taught the language that we might need to communicate our internal experience. I'm thinking about a lot of, you know, how a lot of folks are really socialized based on gender, and the language that they are socialized to use based on the gender that they're socialized as. And so, Ryan, your example earlier about like, you know, you may say you're mad, but really the emotion that's underlying it is sad. But if you're never given the language to speak about sadness, then how could you do that? How could you communicate that to anybody else, let alone to yourself, to slow down and say, oh, I'm actually really sad right now. And not only am I sad, I'm disappointed and I'm slightly frustrated at this situation because it feels unfair to me. And I had higher expectations than this. And I want to bringing it back to not only Perrin, but I think earlier in the series when we see the three boys interacting, Matt and Perrin and Rand, especially as their world has gone into upheaval, like around the Great Hunt is what I'm thinking. How we all, not all of us, but there's often these jokes in the community about how they don't communicate, and if they could just communicate, that they probably would get, some of these problems wouldn't be so big. But it does make me wonder, like, can they communicate their emotional state or experience? Do they even have the language to do that? And if they don't, then how can we expect that of them?
I think that's fair.
It's really
I think
good.
it's a common issue when fighting with partners or other people close to you, that you are convinced that you told them what you need, but you never did.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and also too, I think that brings in, this, Miki and I discussed some negative self-narrating, right, that we can do. And one of those things is mind reading. So sometimes if we are discussing something with someone or we're having a disagreement with someone, we assume that they should just know how we feel about it. They should just know what we think about it. And then conversely, we tend to assume that we know where someone is coming from, or we know what they're really thinking about something, when of course, how could we if they haven't told us?
What I'm getting at a lot is that, and I've often thought about this, is as humans, we are prone to just the most fantastical thinking, that like if I could like put my own thoughts through like a logic machine, like I'd get an F minus, like, right? Like nothing. We're just prone to believing the craziest stuff, like especially, and we could bring this into the conversation, especially when we're in excited emotional states.
Right.
That is scientifically proven that we are cognitive misers at best when we're fine, and then we're worse and we're even more limited mentally when we are in an extreme state.
Mm-hmm.
And put that in the mix.
Yeah, and we're often, I think, given this message too, that we should be able to think logically about all things at all times. And I think because there's that should attached to it, like what Christine was saying earlier, we overestimate how often we are logical and clear and making sense to other people. When you're right, Ryan, like when we're in these, elevated emotional states, you're acting, not necessarily thinking most of the time.
Yeah.
Yes, I think if you go back to the idea of having a fight with a close person to you, if both of them would narrate back the fight, then they would probably present themselves as being very rational and very logical and very calm, and the other side as being completely over the top and not making sense. And both of them would do it because that's how we experience when in a high emotional state. I know that I get something close to rage blackouts sometimes when I'm fighting with my partner. I can't even hear what they're saying. It's just all bad. But I'm very sure that I just made a very, very clear and concise point and did not yell at all myself. Looking back, when I've calmed down, probably looks quite different.
It probably does, but I think too that's also where like the idea of unreliable narration and unreliable self-narration can come into play, because we tend to justify our bad behavior. And in the moment when we are in a very heightened emotional state and we are in conflict with ourselves or with someone else, one way that we justify irrational behavior is that we say, well, but they maybe feel this way, or what they did was wrong, therefore what I did was fine, even though objectively it isn't fine.
Yeah.
And it's just human nature.
I think I'm trying to think of some examples in the book, and I think we see that in Nynaeve a lot in the books. In some ways where it feels almost like a caricature. I think in some ways I feel like Jordan missed the mark a little bit in describing that internal experience, but I do think that that's how I think that it's accurate. I think in some ways Nynaeve is all of us in that we're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I was perfectly calm and logical in my insistence that we take a carriage instead of a boat, and and then like 2 chapters later, well, I was clear that we should have taken a boat because it would have been faster, and I don't know who thought that I said anything other than taking a boat.
Yeah.
And the famous "I never yell, she yelled."
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And in that instance, I think that he deviates a little bit from his limited third-person narrator. That
Yes.
the narrator saying she yelled is obviously an objective narrator who points out to us what is happening. And I'm very fine with him taking that liberty because it makes it funnier.
Well, it's funnier, and in those instances, I have to wonder how much he's drawing from his own personal relationships. Like, maybe I
Probably.
can't say this to my wife's face, therefore I'm going to just put it in print like, she yelled, I never yell.
That's funny. And actually, to this point, and this relates back to our earlier conversation. I hope this isn't too confusing, but when we were talking about how our characters experience extreme things and then move on, Dane Lou's asking, is this perhaps a trauma response that RJ learned from Vietnam? That he just puts it behind him.
I'm pretty sure that's it. And I think that in this case, he just fails to diversify with his characters. He gives everyone the same response because he is himself very limited there by the trauma. Mm-hmm. So I'm of course only speculating, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that's not. It's hard. I don't want to like assume anything about Robert Jordan's like recovery journey from war.
Right.
He became, he obviously found religion, and he was very successful and very productive. So it's hard. I don't know if it's fair to say that he is, limited in these ways. It's a speculation that's not out of the blue, and it's not unfair. But I personally just don't know enough to like stand behind that.
I wonder how much of it is generational too, though.
Generational, gendered. I mean, there's so many factors that can play into how we have a response. But I think what you're pointing out is an interesting thing when we look at these books, right? Is that they are written by a single human being. I mean, and with the help of an editorial team and stuff. But so there are ways in which we see that limited viewpoint coming through in these multiple characters. And maybe we can pick it apart in a book series that's like The Wheel of Time, because he did such an amazing job at making it complex and making all of these different characters have different attributes and stuff, where we might not see that in some other book series. It just like all feels kind of one-dimensional, and Jordan made it so three-dimensional that we can kind of hiccup every once in a while when we catch those one-dimensional moments.
I mean, it's a limited perspective, writing limited perspectives that are experienced by limited perspectives from us. So it's a wonder we even get anything out of this, but it somehow works.
Yeah, exactly.
Well put.
But now that we mentioned Nynaeve, we can get into Nynaeve, because when talking about unreliable or limited narratives in The Wheel of Time, I think the two characters that come up all the time are Nynaeve and Matt, for their oftentimes funny failure to see themselves clearly. So what do you guys think makes someone an especially unreliable narrator? What are the characteristics that make you present, even to yourself, such a different picture of what is happening around you?
That's an interesting question. And I want to jump in real quick because I kind of have an extreme view that most people are unreliable. And it takes a lot of work on, the mental, emotional, part of yourself to be able to become like, I guess, like in a Jungian, like individuated, to be like just solid, like most people I encounter, if you ask them, are you this way? And they say, oh yeah, are you a good person? Yeah, I'm a good person. And there's probably, many examples of not being good. That's a very simplified way of saying it. But yeah, like I've often felt that encountering the world, I believe that most people are like not really getting exactly how they're presenting themselves to the world. And their belief about themselves is incongruent with how they're presenting in actuality. And it's very rare to find someone who believes one thing about themselves and presents it, and there's like a balance in it. And those people I feel very calm around. Right, like you're right, like for me, like as I'm like empathetically moving throughout the world, those humans who are like that is it, and so it doesn't have to be good or bad. If this people could be like, I'm a piece of shit, and they're acting like a piece of shit, I still feel calmer because I don't feel like that incongruence. It makes me nervous because I don't always know what to anticipate, and so it's but I feel like I have a more extreme view of that. I don't know if
I don't think you're wrong. I'm just curious why, for example, Naive is so extreme in this.
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about why I think she's so extreme in this. Going back to what Miki said about cognitive dissonance, I mean, that's something that we as human beings try to avoid. It's really uncomfortable to be conflicted all the time. It sucks. You feel gross, you feel yucky, you feel uptight, you feel upset all the time. And no one wants to go through life feeling that way. And I think for her, she feels very conflicted a lot of the time, and she's not dealing with the issues that she's conflicted about. So she overcompensates in other areas of her life, right? She, rather than focusing inward and thinking about what is it about myself that maybe is making me uncomfortable, what are these fears that I'm dealing with on a daily basis? Because I do think for Naive, a lot of what she doesn't deal with is fear-based. She is terrified of losing the people that she loves. She is so afraid of not being in control of the people that she feels that she's responsible for, which is all of Emmons Field in one way or another. But then later, specifically the boys and Egwene, she feels personally responsible for their well-being and their safety. And when she can't guarantee that, it's very, very difficult for her. So she becomes more controlling and she becomes much more reactive. And it's only later when she finally surrenders, right? And it's not really that she's not just surrendering to the source. She's just surrendering to the fact that she can't control things. And then that's when we kind of start to see this change in her as a character, where she becomes a little bit freer because she's being more forgiving of herself and what she sees as shortcomings.
Do you think that this is also a factor that everyone try to fulfill their duties, right? But Nynaeve is the only one who isn't where her duty, as she always thought she had, lies. Because deep down, she must think that I should be in my village. She takes care of these kids because, like, they're the last remnant of the community she is bound to serve, essentially. And she doesn't. And when she surrenders, maybe she also accepts that her duty has shifted, that she can give up that part of herself and now concentrate on what she has been doing for a long time at this point, but never really reconciled with herself.
Well, she was directly confronted with that in her, I believe, her accepted test.
That's what I thought about. Yes.
Yeah. And that might be like a function of that, where she's able to. But also, I kind of feel like and then again, this might be a limitation in Robert Jordan, but all of the Emmons Fielders just kind of were like, boom. Once they left, like rarely were they like nostalgic for Emmons Field.
Egwene was the weirdest, right? I mean, she was writing her parents, but she never made an attempt to go back at all. So like, I'm gone. I'm fine now.
Yeah. Shoot, I had a thought about the last thing you questioned. I wanted to go back.
About Nynaeve?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, thank you. Nynaeve. So when I think about Nynaeve and her, that the essence, like the thing that we're talking about, where her belief in her about herself and how she's presenting it are different. I think about how anger has been so wrapped up in her development, like and so and it's such a fascinating thing to think about. Like, imagine the only time you are in a flow state or you're at your best is when you're at your angriest. I can't even imagine like taking a young person, and that's the only way that they could get optimal results is to just be in a fucking rage. I'm sorry, in a rage, right? Like, so it's astounding that she's able to do anything, or that she's able to like function in society. But I, if you think about it, though, I think like she punched some girl or some lady in Tarvalon like within the first month of going there. I think Robert Jordan really showed that like she's just a rageaholic, and that's and again, like what I had said earlier, when you're at your extreme emotional states, even if you're practiced in it, even if you're great at being super angry, you're not as you're limited. You're by design limited in your ability to think things through or have options and ways of perceiving things. So if she's so I've always thought of that as an integral part of her character, and like why she's so weird.
Well, and I think that goes back to Anna's initial question, which is like, why is Nynaeve such a good example of this unreliable narrator, in that in order to be able to achieve her optimal flow, anger always had to be like right there, right? And so she had to keep a narrative of the world going that was congruent with this idea that it's okay for her to be angry. There's always going to be a reason to be angry.
Where she has been wronged by Moraine.
Exactly.
She
right?
needs, so she held on to this really hard and really longer than she could justify at all.
Exactly. Yes. And when Moraine
sense.
wasn't close by, there were
Thank you.
There were other things to be angry about at that time. So I think it served her. It was adaptive for her. But I think that's like any other adaptive coping skill. It works for a period of time, and then the world continues on, and then it's no longer adaptive, but we keep using it.
Well, it's maladaptive at that point.
Yep.
It becomes a maladaptive code. And I think for someone like Nynaeve, it feels like strength, right? When you are super pissed off and it's a righteous anger, boy, like how powerful do you feel? You feel like you could do anything and it would be fine because you are filled with a righteous rage. And I think for her, a lot of it is that it gives her this sense of power and control when we know that she does not feel powerful all the time. I mean, she just doesn't, she's scared. She's like afraid for these people she loves. She's afraid that people don't take her seriously because she's young and she's the wisdom of Emmons Field. So I think for her, it's a source of righteous anger equaling power.
Yeah. She's basically,
and then she overcompensates in the other direction and calls herself a coward in her head.
Yes. Exactly. Yes. She has to beat herself up. So if there's no one externally to be angry with, she can at least be angry at herself for not being better.
Yep.
Right.
Ryan, did you want to say anything else about Nynaeve?
Oh, she's the Incredible Hulk, but like, but like she'll like get all angry.
The yellow one.
She'll get all angry and rip her clothes off, and then do surgery on you.
Okay.
And heal you.
Yeah, she'll kill you, and she'll be like, "God damn it, let me heal you."
Okay, if we're done with Nynaeve, then let's go to the other prime example, our beloved Matrim I'm No Bloody Hero Cawthon, who's also great at misrepresenting himself in his head, but I think for very different reasons, right? Mm-hmm. What's going on there? Why does he have this very set picture of himself that is not positive, and why does he cling to it?
I think, I'm noticing I'm jumping in first again, so I just want to check in. Do you all have any?
Take it away. I went crazy with Nynaeve. You take it over, Nat.
Well, okay, so
I'm
With
watching the
Matt,
clock.
I'm wondering, so Nynaeve has this control thing, right? Like, you know, she wants to, there is this underlying fear, like Christine was saying. But for me, I read Matt's incongruence is coming from this desire for freedom and feeling trapped. Because when you hear him talk about things and when he's seeking things, it usually seems to come from this desire for freedom. I'll get enough money so I'll never have to milk my dog's cows again. You know, I'm no bloody hero. I need to just be able to ride off into the sunset. I'm not going to fight this battle with you. You know, I'm not going to come rescue you. All of those things, but it's this desire for freedom. So I think internally Matt feels trapped. And when things show up in his world that feel constricting to him or feel like they might be a trap, you know, he shifts it around in his head of like, well, I'm not going to be trapped by that. But at the same time, it sounds like some of his actions that he does actually fit these like deeper internal values of friendship and loyalty, right? Because Matt is, I would say, one of the most loyal characters in the books. And so how do you mesh a deep value of loyalty and a fear of loss of freedom? And I think it comes out as Matrim Cawthon.
And also a fear of not living up to the loyalty, which we see in the flicker scene.
Oh, yeah.
Because there he, apparently, we never know what happens, but at least to himself, he sees it as failing his responsibility for his friend.
Not only failing, but like betrayal, like intentionally letting people down.
But maybe he never did. When we look at this now, it's very possible that he only ever, like in a drunken bar night, mentioned something, did a Frodo with the cow jumps over the moon.
Could have. That's possible.
That's the thing. It's unreliable to us.
So when you question, you said why, it made me think about how we don't know the whys of any of these characters. We don't, and that's again like, how much can you expect an author to really put into a story? But we don't know what his parents were like. We know his dad was kind of like a shady, conniving, like, but we don't see any evidence of any early childhood traumas. For the only early childhood trauma I could even think about is Ulver, and then Rand as a baby. That might have been pretty traumatic, but that's all he probably doesn't remember that. So we don't see anything that would underlie like character defects in any of these. We just kind of have to like accept that this is the way they are. So it's hard to answer why. I don't know why Matt is like that. I've always wondered. I wish I could read that, like that story of all of their lives. I want to know why. And also, why is Rand able to do what he's able to do? Like, what did Tam give Rand that's positive to make him so capable? I always think of like Rand's, being the transcendent figure he is, solely like, his upbringing with Tam, because Tam seems so awesome. But I'm just making assumptions. We don't read that story, so.
Anything else about Matt? Because if not, then we can go back to something that I started to talk about earlier, but I was too quick and jumped ahead. About all the little biases that we tend to have, which cloud our perspectives and make us such unreliable narrators in our own heads, which Robert Jordan, I think, portrays really well. Cultural and gender roles and all this. Go.
Yeah, Ryan, you go first.
Yeah, no, Christine go first.
Me go first.
Yep.
You haven't gone first in a long time.
Oh, I haven't. Okay.
Well, your dog hasn't really chimed in yet. Oh, now he's like, I'm out of here.
Lucy, she just jumped off and ripped my earbuds out of my ears too. This is life with a Jack Russell. I'm just going to tell you right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's life with Jack Russell. So biases, I mean, I would say that biases are everywhere. You have, well, one of the more glaring ones are the biases that most people seem to have for Aes Sedai. And anyone, particularly in Emmons Field, anybody who can channel, they are immediately suspicious of. And to me, that seems almost like a metaphor for people who come from small towns being very heavily biased against people who come from more urban settings or from anything that could be perceived as different than what they are used to. So, and I see you smiling, Anna. So what are you thinking?
No, it's just what I often say, how much my perspectives have broadened since I've met so many people across the globe, which have such different upbringings that I even knew there were when I.
Yeah.
Because when you say small town and I say small town, these are very different things. What we call
Oh,
rural, you would probably call suburban, because we don't have rural like you do.
yeah.
Mhm.
We have a lot more space too.
Mhm.
But I think any type of community that's somewhat isolated in one way or another, it just sort of it makes it easy for people to form these biases because you don't know if you're not exposed to something other than what you've grown up with. And it's not like they have television, they don't have the internet, like they don't have like these different ways that we have to educate ourselves about things outside of our immediate sphere. And so I can see how like Matt and Rand would actually all of them would immediately be resistant to Maureen trying to help because they're instantly suspicious of her motives. Regardless of whether her motives are pure or not, they are just instantly suspicious.
Because
And I
of
think,
one saying that everyone has.
yes.
Yeah. And then I was thinking about this today, which is, I think this is such a great example of biases playing out because I was thinking about the dream thing, right? Maureen says, hey, tell me if you're having bad dreams. Balsamon says, hey, don't tell her that you're having bad dreams. Who do the boys believe? Which advice do they take? They take Balsamon's advice, like Satan's advice.
Yeah.
Because their bias is so deeply ingrained to not trust Aes Sedai that their brain just doesn't even wrap around the fact that like Balsamon is telling you don't trust her. And that's the direction you're going to go.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen that in real life of, people leaning towards and leaning into their biases of, people who identify in particular ways, right? Because biases come in all shapes and forms, right? But if we think about like racial bias or gender bias or any of these other biases that are so detrimental, they can be subtle at the same time where people think that they're making their own decisions, but oftentimes it's a decision being pushed by these biases that they're bringing along with them.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as like I think of like biases as like concentric circles, right? Like, and that's why everything's so. But it's also these concentric circles are, commingle in ways that are really complicated, and that's why I like studying an individual and socio and the society and their interaction is really hard to do because the individual has a bias, and then like their like peer group have like a bias, and there's literally studies about like within group and without group beliefs. Like, so if your within group are the people that you identify with, and you will find more individual differences. You'll an actual number of differences in these studies, and then if you look at a group of people that you don't know, you'll see them as a homogenized group of people who don't have variances.
Right.
And that and so you just then extrapolate further. So that could be like a group of 5 of your friends, or and then like it goes to like your community, and then it goes to like national identity, and then you could like extrapolate further. Like each concentric circle carries like biases that are hard to unravel, starting with the individual, moving on out. And that's why I think like Robert Jordan's such a great writer, because he's like able to like encapsulate that in so many cool ways. A lot of it just through dialogue and like movement, and but also like, you know, it's fruitful things to think about, because it really is what we all are dealing with. Like the world is complicated, and we are not computers like accurately like disseminating information back and forth. We're nowhere near that. We are chaos monkeys trying to like make sense of more chaotic shit. And like anytime we can create a connection, it's literally magical, because the forces are pushing us against each other, because we can't even really perceive reality in ways that we think we can.
Yes. Well, and to just kind of like boil that down a little bit, I think we can look at biases as not necessarily a negative thing, right? So sometimes our biases can be very grounding, because there are so many concentric circles and there are so many different elements and nuances and things like that. It is overwhelming for us because our brains just aren't designed to know and understand everything. So biases are sort of like a Cliff's Notes way for our brains to dissimulate all this stuff, right? Like, all right, well, I have this bias about this group of people, therefore they go in this box. And I have this bias about this situation and it goes in that box. And it just makes it much easier on us mentally to be able to categorize things very quickly. And that's where judgment and biases can sometimes play a positive role. But unfortunately, when we rely too heavily on them, they can play a very negative role.
When we fail to re-examine them, once we move into the group where it would be important to see, for example, these people as individuals, but we don't, then we have problems. When Ryan mentioned that people are not computers, I sometimes think these characters in these books want to be computers because they tend to think very binary.
Yeah.
Especially with gender. I
Yes.
mean, all men, all women. And also all Kyrianen and all Aiel.
Well, and that all or nothing thinking, like Christine was talking about, that all or nothing thinking can be a shortcut, you know, like a mental shortcut. And I like this comparing to the computer binary, because I mean, right, the next step is quantum computing, right, where you can be both 1 and a 0 at the same time. And I think too often, you know, human beings act like analog computers where we're either a 1 or a 0. It's all or it's nothing. And
I'm a 1.
yeah, we know that, Ryan. Absolutely.
It's not concentric circles. It's all Venn diagrams.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think, because it feels easier sometimes to use this all or nothing language, right? Like, oh, well, you know, all those country folk are this way, all those city folk are this way. And, you know, and I think he captures that in the books. And it's, again, sometimes it can feel a little bit like a caricature, but I also think it's very real. I think we can pull real life examples of, I mean, heck, if I just opened my Twitter feed right now, I'm sure I could just like first screen, pick out some all or nothing language that is being thrown out there. So I do think that as human beings, we get caught up in it. And I think in, you know, the world that Jordan created, his folks do it too. And it causes the same problems, this assumption that, you know, all men are wool-headed idiots, and they don't know what's going on, and they need to be
That's true, though. Come on.
I mean, yeah.
No offense, Ryan.
But you're still number 1.
No,
I said I'm a 1. No, I didn't say number 1. I think there's the 1s and 0s. I was like, if I gotta choose, I'm gonna be a 1. Like, all right, let's respond to Matt real quick. Matt's spooky stabbing stick, which is again one of the most inappropriate names. How much is the White Tower perpetuating the stigma by their self-secluding secretive culture?
Oh yeah, they're idiots.
They're definitely perpetuating it. I think they are anyways. I mean, anyway.
Okay, so we all in agreement. The White Tower. Okay. Now,
Are you going to oversimplify this? Are you going to make this like a binary argument?
no, I
here?
just love this. Like the White Tower idiots. Yeah, I mean, I've often thought like there's so much unintended harm in what
Yeah.
is being done throughout like this turning of the wheel that we're reading. Like I keep thinking about like the Age of Legends. I know everyone's like, yeah, this and this, but like, yeah, there's like way better. They got way further in their like development before their shit broke.
Yeah.
But this story, like they're still on fucking horses and they can't get their shit together and they're like infighting and it's like one of the like everyone, no one is handling power correctly, uh, which is fascinating. It's almost like across the board. But I'm sorry, I get a little tangent. But you said the White Tower are idiots, and yes, I've often thought like they have an opportunity to do so much better, and they just can't get it past themselves.
But I think that they're also a really great example of how, what the human mind does with a vacuum, right? With silence, which is what they create. They create a vacuum of knowledge. They have it, but they sit on it. And so people like nature abhors a vacuum. And so human beings will fill silence with something. And so people make up stories about them. They project onto the Aes Sedai. And I think we experience that as human beings too. Sometimes we may have knowledge that we're sitting on or afraid to share, or whatever reason we don't share it. And in our silence, other people project things onto us that may or may not be accurate or true, that can be challenged if we speak up and share. And I think the Aes Sedai create a really nice example of that for us as a monolith, so to speak.
And coming back to the concentric circles, they don't only do that outward, they also do it inwardly.
Yes.
Like they have the 13th dispository where they keep knowledge even from themselves. And it's all mostly about failure. Every time they fail, they don't tell. And they let people make up. I mean, in New Spring, it's shown that Lan asks Moraine what makes him trust her is that she answers this question, why didn't the Aes Sedai help when Makia fell? The answer is they tried and they didn't get there in time. And rather than admitting that I don't know, their horse lost a shoe or whatever happened there, rather than that, they let everyone believe that they didn't give a shit.
Yeah.
I don't get it at all. And the fact that Moraine goes against all the custom and I think the law and tells him that's a good thing for her and for him and for his picture of Aes Sedai. And it shows that it would help. And they also do it to themselves. Like nobody knows how many Amerlin Seed have failed, have been deposed, have been killed because they don't tell.
No, and they have a culture of because I said so. I'm thinking just even the test to be raised as Aes Sedai, you have the 100 weaves. And I think each time we read it, it's all agreed that these are useless weaves. Nobody knows why you are making sparks on weave 72 or whatever it is. You just know you have to because they said so. And I think anytime that you're in kind of like a system or an organization that has that because we said so, at so many levels. I mean, sometimes you just have to move forward and say this is the way it's going to be. But for the most part, it's a lack of sharing. There's a lack of detail of just believe us. You have to be on the star. You have to create this weave at this time, and that's all that has to happen. It just leads to this idea of you don't have to explain anything. You just should assume that people are going to do what you say when you say it.
Well, I mean, to some extent, and this is as we draw this episode to a close, there is a dark side to the unreliable narrator that all con men know. If you're going to be, and like abusers and emotional abusers and gaslighters and whatever, like there are people walk around with the understanding about how little you know, but they know that you don't know. And that fact is exploited everywhere. And I think this is it's important to keep that in mind. Like corporations know how little we know, con men face to face know how little you know.
And they know which shortcuts we take,
Yeah,
and they
and they know,
exploit those.
and they know what we're usually willing to accommodate to just to get through a social interaction safely. So many things happen. Like it's fun to think about, like that unreliable narrator, that third person limited perspective that we all carry around is the the thing that can causes so much conflict. It's the thing that makes two people with good intentions not able to bridge those biases and those limitations. But it also, as we're maneuvering through the world, people with bad intentions utilize that against us. So I'm glad we talked about this. I'm glad we brought this up. I think it's a really good conversation. I think we're at the point where we should start doing our kind of summarizations and our intentions. So I started with that. I think, again, like Robert Jordan's genius writing, it is just a starting point. So we talked about the books. We've talked about real life. I think the idea of the unreliable narrator, we should all really appreciate the connections we do have, right? Like this is what I'm taking out of this, is that when we actually connect on a real level with someone, taking everything that we're talking about in consideration, it's magic, and it's alchemy. It's like it's taking like a bad situation and creating gold. So that's what I'm taking out of this conversation.
I think what I'm taking out of this conversation is that, as human beings, we need to be mindful of what type of narrators we are in our own lives, and just be okay with the fact that we are unreliable in our narration because we don't know everything. And that's okay. It's okay to not know everything, because frankly, not everything is our business. And that sometimes, instead of just giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt, we need to also offer other people the benefit of the doubt too. Because, like it was mentioned very early on in this episode, we don't always know what people are going through. Just because we're reading their micro expressions, or just because they're responding or not responding in a certain way, it doesn't mean that it's because of us. It doesn't mean that it's about us. It could be far more nuanced than that. And so I think that's my takeaway, is that maybe, as human beings, we could all be a little kinder to each other and to ourselves as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think for me, one of the mantras that I try to hold is, just because you think it doesn't make it true. And I think that's, I think that's something we get really attached to, this idea that our thoughts are truth. And I think this conversation, one of the things that comes out of conversations like this, and I think has really been highlighted today, is, the ways that what we experience may not always be accurate. What we think may not always be accurate. But Ryan, going back to your point, like the benefit of creating these close and trusting relationships, having people with whom you can be vulnerable and open and share those actual thoughts that are going on in your head, give us these mirrors that can then reflect back to us, like whether or not it's accurate. And I think it also, it's important to choose mirrors who are going to be truthful to us, but also recognizing I'm not going to be able to repeat what you said earlier, but it was so good about this being written by,
a limited perspective.
Yes, the limited
Writing
perspective
limited
of a limited
perspectives,
perspective.
being read by limited perspectives. Yeah,
exactly. That's it. That right there on it captures what I'm taking away from this, is that's the world we live in. And that's and if we can remember that at times, I think that makes the world a little bit easier to navigate, to just remind ourselves. So I'll quote from a different book. Another book that I really love is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And there's a point in the Hitchhiker's Guide where it's going through the population of the universe. And it first explains that the size of the universe is infinite. And so then it goes on to mathematically describe to us that mathematically speaking, there are a limited number of populated planets, but any limited number divided by an infinite number is close to zero is not. And so therefore, any people you run into happen to be just figments of your imagination. And so,
we all live in a simulation, for sure.
Exactly. It's all perspective. And if we can just keep that in mind, then it makes the life a little bit easier to not take ourselves quite so seriously.
What I take away from this is that you're all very smart, much smarter than me. So you took all my points.
Stop.
You took all my points already.
No. Not true.
Mine is stepping back, be mindful about what I experience and how I react to it. Because as I mentioned before, I'm sometimes very guilty of being very irrational when in a heightened emotional state. And coming back to your mantra, Miki, I heard you will do a guided meditation for us.
That is, yes.
That is wonderful. I'm going to mute myself so I don't cough through it.
Excellent. And Ryan, do you have some background stuff for us for today?
Oh, we're getting it ready. I'm super excited. This has been a great episode. Everyone, we are going to end with a guided meditation. This is going to be a traditional thing. And let me start with... here we go. Here's our guided meditation music. And we're going to go full screen.
Thank you. So this evening, pulling from the books, I decided to do a guided meditation on the flower blossom. It's a traditional meditation that the Aes Sedai use to open themselves up. And I thought we could riff on that a little bit tonight. So if you will all just get yourself into a comfortable position wherever you are, allow yourself to just be present for the next few moments and enjoy this experience. So I'd like you to start by just taking a gentle breath in and breathing out. And on your next breath in, I want you to picture a blossom in your mind. This could be any blossom, one that speaks to you, just any flower blossom coming into your mind. This blossom is closed and just waiting to open. As we do this, other thoughts, images, sensations, and sounds will come in because that's what they do. And each time, just allow yourself to redirect and come back to that picture of the blossom in your mind. This blossom is closed tightly. And as it is, I want you to just bring your awareness to yourself. Notice if there are any areas of tightness within you, just as this blossom is closed tightly. You don't need to do anything about that tightness. You don't need to change it in any way. It's just simply about seeing it in the same way that you see this blossom and recognizing within the tightness that there is a potential to unfurl. As you take your next breath in, I'd like you to allow your attention to drift down to your feet. Allow your attention to settle there as if it were a ray of sunshine settling on your feet. Notice that your feet feel warm, heavy, and relaxed. Your attention just settles there and allows your feet to feel warm, heavy, and relaxed. Your attention begins to spread up your legs like that warm beam of sunlight coming through a window. Up to your thighs. And there you become aware of your thighs feeling warm and heavy. Your awareness continues to shift up into your core. Within your core, you feel warm, relaxed, and noticing the tightness within beginning to loosen. Your awareness continues up as that warm ray of sunshine drifting to your chest and shoulders. Your chest and shoulders feel warm, soft, and open. And your awareness rises to your face and mind as if sunlight is washing over you, and you feel warm, open, and aware. I want you to hold that image of a blossom warmed by sunshine. Remain aware that that blossom is not feeling pressure of any have-tos or should-haves. The blossom just is. The blossom is warm and it unfurls at its own pace. The blossom is there. It is not pushed by any all or nothing beliefs. The blossom is in a perpetual state of transition, shifting from moment to moment, unfurling so slowly that at times you may not notice, but it is never still. It is never all one way or all no way. It just is. As the petals open, there is a gentle acceptance, an acceptance of the sun, an acceptance of wind, an acceptance of rain. Notice any tightness within you, whether it is physical tightness or emotional tightness, that perhaps can unfurl just a little bit, that may grow just a little bit. Any tightness that may transform just a little bit. And as with the blossom, be open to shifting to some fruitful thing. Again, bringing your attention to your chest, allowing a breath in and a breath out, feeling yourself unfurl, and being ready to accept whatever comes next. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.